Hello, everybody. My name is Lisa Parks. I'm a professor in comparative media studies here at MIT. And I'm really delighted to be here. It's one of the first events I've really done here at MIT, and I'm so thrilled to be here with Trevor. And I want to thank all the organizers and staff especially. Trevor and I first met at the Transmediale Festival in Berlin about 10 years ago. And at that time, we both shared an interest in satellites. I put up the slide of this book because Trevor contributed to it generously. And at that time, Trevor was trying to photograph satellites from the surface of the Earth, and I was trying to study them in terms of their cultural implications. We shared an interest not only in satellites, but in other things such as telecommunication infrastructures, the electromagnetic spectrum, and at one point I ended up being kind of his Sherpa and walking up a mountain with him for a couple of days while he was shooting in the Nevada desert, shooting this Area 1 shot at Groom Lake. And at that time, it was really fascinating because I got a sense of the invisible labor that his work required when he was lugging cameras around to different sites to shoot secret government installations throughout the western part of the US. We're going to spend most of our time, this half hour, talking about Trevor's machine vision work. But before we get into that, I thought I would just take a few minutes to talk about some of my own research and to lay out some things that we might return to in discussion. I'm a media scholar, and some of my recent work has combined field work, drawn upon work in the area of phenomenology and media making to explore infrastructural sites or processes that are invisible, you might even say culturally unintelligible as opposed to literally invisible, yet are integral to media cultures and media economics and industries. And to use that field work as a way of also trying to formulate critical languages and for making these sites intelligible, so that in media studies, not all of our work is about looking at content on screens or analyzing narrative structure, but actually thinking about how signals move invisibly and imperceptibly throughout different parts of the world. And some of this work has also been about studying peripheries within the global media economy rather than the sites such as Hollywood or Bollywood or Nollywood, to think really about various sites. So I'll just give you a sense of some of these sites. I'm interested in, for example, thinking about what it means in the context of the war in the former Yugoslavia to ruin a socialist telecommunication system and bring it literally to the ground. I have tried to think about the physical arrangement of socio-technical relations of mobile telephony infrastructure in Mongolia, and how there's a completely resourceful and innovative way in which walking phone workers actually help to move signals throughout Ulaanbaatar. I've also been interested in the work of electrical linemen. I think electrical line men and women are undergirding our global media economy. And I've worked a little bit with this artist, Michael Parker, who has done studies in the training grounds of these linemen to try to make visible their labor in maintaining, repairing, and sustaining the operation of power grids that are integral to the global media and digital economy. And then in the last few years, I've been working in rural Zambia with some computer scientists and local communities in Macha to try to understand how, when we talk about the global digital economy and internet infrastructure, often water gets kind of overlooked as completely essential to thinking about global digitization. In these areas, there could be no internet users without women water carriers who carry water to keep people alive so that they could use cell phones and the internet. So I try to also think about these systems relationally as well. And then just a couple more examples, and then we'll move on. one of my grad students at UC Santa Barbara was doing work with migrant farm workers and digital radio in Oxnard, California. So thinking about how signals are moving across farm fields where strawberries are being picked and signals are being broadcast in Mixteco and Zapotec indigenous languages that are largely unspoken and unheard in many parts of California, even though people migrate from Oaxaca, Mexico, and speak only those languages. And then finally, I've also been trying to think about the grounded dimensions of drone warfare, to not only think about drone war from the perspective of the remote cockpit pilot sensor interfaces, but like what's happening on the ground, and that's part of a broader part of this work. When I do this work, I try to think about it as footprint analysis, and I start with maps of coverage zones, of electronic coverage zones or networks, and then I literally walk through those areas in an effort to combine cartography with site-based fieldwork and geoannotation. I'm in the process, some of this work is laid out in this book that I recently published with my former PhD student, Nicole Staroselsky, called Signal Traffic. And then I'm trying to develop a lab here. I'm in the process of developing a lab within comparative media studies and writing called Global Media Technologies and Cultures Lab. So the kinds of images that I've shown you very quickly here, and the kinds of images we've seen in some of Trevor's previous work, which I know many of you are very familiar with, involved a photographer carrying or moving camera equipment to particular sites and then framing objects or fields of view in an effort to make invisible things visible. And so this practice involved a human camera operator and assumed the reader of the images would be a human. What's really interesting and exciting about Trevor's current work and his new work is that he's trying to get us to think about what happens when humans are removed from the equation of image production and consumption, or at least we can get into this a little bit more. But so what we're going to talk about today, and what I'm going to ask him to talk about right now to get us into this discussion, is what Trevor's calling invisible images, which are becoming increasingly ubiquitous and kind of signal a major shift, he's arguing, in our visual culture. So we're going to shift now to the other slide. And then I'm going to ask Trevor to get us started with a question. And maybe while we're switching over, I could just start off, Trevor, by asking you with a quite general question. You argued in a provocative piece in New Inquiry recently that during the last decade, visual culture, quote, has become detached from human eyes and largely become invisible. Mm-hmm. So maybe you could tell us what you mean by that.
So like what you were, I think we definitely both have a shared interest in infrastructures and signals moving through infrastructures and what the consequences of that are. And I think like one of the, to me, one of the most dramatic things that has kind of but also my background as an artist. So I'm interested in not only how images function in the world, but how we read them, like what are these very strange things that we call images. And I would sort of submit that over the last really about 10 years or so that we've seen the emergence of a very different kind of images that have come online. And these are images that machines make in order to be able to communicate with other machines, right? Mm-hmm. And there's lots of examples of that. So a very basic example would be like a self-driving car. It has to move around the city, it has to kind of collect some kind of information about that city, turn it into something that it can use, but it's like really an imaging system that is made for like one kind of machining system for a different machining system to do something with. Mm-hmm. And it's completely invisible. The kind of image that we see here on the left, that's made for humans to be able to diagnose how that machine vision system is working. That's for us. It doesn't need that, right? However, the stuff that the images that it makes for itself are the same stuff that any other digital image is made out of. It's just not rendered into a human form. There's many, many different kinds of examples of this. You can go with facial recognition in cities and airports and smartphones and shopping centers. You can talk about computer vision systems used in supply chains, manufacturing, quality control. We were talking with Benjamin Bratton yesterday about their use in agriculture. And this also extends to domains of image making that I think we would normally think of as being human to human, like in social media, for example. Like I might share something on social media with you, and we look at it, we share like, oh, that's a cute picture, whatever, what have you. And the metaphor that we have for that exchange would be like a photo album or sharing photos where it feels like, oh, I'm showing you this photograph, and that's corporeally, that's what it feels like, what's going on. But in the background, that's not at all what's going on. You're feeding it to a database of sorts, and that image is being continually mined by very powerful algorithms and artificial neural networks, convolutional neural networks. They're trying to extract metadata from that about us, about our relationship, about what kinds of objects are in those images, who is in those images, what can we learn from, those sorts of things. And so I think that all of this adds up to a world in which actually most of the images made in the world right now are made by machines for other machines. And they see in profoundly different ways than we do, or see, what have you. And in that old model of humans, seeing an image and interpreting it and reading it, like basically the whole entire field of like visual studies and much of like literary criticism in these kinds of fields has to be modified to think about how these non-human imaging systems not only see but do work in the world. And so I think the project I've been working on for a number of years, and this is actually the first time I'm ever talking about this publicly other than that article that I wrote, is being to try to, first of all, figure out what is the formal aspects of these. In other words, like what actually are images that are made by machines for other machines, and then how do they operate differently than the way that images made by humans for other humans operate.
Can you talk a little bit about the material processes kind of on the back end of the generation of these images, and maybe walk us through some specific examples so we get a sense of the work that you've done to try to render this intelligible to us?
Yeah. So, over the years, we're just using, we're not doing original research. I run an art studio. It's not scholarship, whatever. We're just basically finding some off-the-shelf tools as well as developing our own tools in the studio that allows us to do like what that image of the self-driving car was doing, to implement a computer vision system and then draw stuff for us that tries to show us as a human what a particular system is looking at. And these are some examples of that. Some of the computer vision systems are very simple, just looking for edges, lines, relationships between one image and the next, purely kind of formal operations. And an image like this kind of speaks to that. This is a series of algorithms are overlaid on a photograph. But then we get further and further into this world, and this is a kind of a representation of an image that a facial recognition system would use. It's a kind of image that would, where if I want to recognize your face, I want to just basically figure out what the fingerprint of your face is. What's the difference between your face and everybody else's face in the world? And that's what I want to know. And that kind of produces images like this in some instances.
So is that like an approximation of a digital approximation of someone's face based on a machine looking at multiple images of that face?
Yeah, exactly, okay. Exactly. And that's what this kind of image is as well. And that we don't really have vocabularies for these kinds of images, so that's been a kind of another part of the project, is sort of like inventing language within the studio just so we can talk to each other about what some of these things are. This is a kind of image that we're calling a linear classifier, and that's a real word. And this is kind of a quick and dirty way to do object recognition. And what you do in this technique is you might take like 1 million images, and those 1 million images are organized into 1,000 classes of different objects, right? So you would say oranges and apples and grapefruits and the sun and basketballs or what have you. And then you write a very simple thing that you can do is create an image that is almost like a template for what all of those different classes should look like. In other words, an image that represents statistically what an image of a given object is most likely to look like. So for example, this would be a candle. This is a rose. This is a shark. And what this technique's doing is just going through every pixel of every image of a shark and saying, like, this pixel is probably going to be some version of gray in the middle, because that's probably where the shark is. Like an image, a pixel on the outside of it's probably going to be some kind of blue, because the shark's probably in the ocean.
So before you go, just so I understand, and could these images, if there was such a thing as a visual search engine, could that be put in as an input, and then presumably you would have a bunch of images of sharks returned?
Well, that's the next step that we're doing. So this is a much cruder way to do that. And what you're talking about doing is actually some work that we're just getting to be able to work now, which is using neural networks and sort of the more advanced way of doing like these object recognition stuff is you train a neural network how to see things. And so we've been training our own networks, and then what we can do is say, okay, artificial intelligence, you have learned how to recognize what a shark is. Now draw me a picture of a shark. And these are the kinds of images that you get back when you do that. We basically say, evolve this image until you're 99% confident that it's a shark, and then show me what you've got. And it's different every time that we do that, which is really kind of interesting. So there's this kind of thing, and then we're doing even weirder stuff where we're saying, evolve me an image, like neural network, evolve me an image of what's happening at a particular neuron and what's normally like a hidden layer of that. So show me an image of something that you've invented to try to recognize other kinds of objects. And you get these weird, almost like photorealistic of things that like don't exist, that just a neural network kind of made up.
So the machine vision then, in some sense, re-educates us about how we might see.
Exactly, like the formal qualities of it are just really different than the way that humans work. And I get in big fights about, computer vision scientists about this, because they would insist like, no, humans see with edges. I'm like, humans don't see with edges. That has like almost nothing to do with it. You know what I mean? Like, but anyway, you can have those kind of conversations. But I think the other part of the project, though, is really thinking about the consequences of that, And this is kind of a joke, kind of. I'm just showing you stuff from my sketchbooks, basically, from this project. And this is kind of a funny image. It says, it's like a neural network saying, like, this is definitely a red and green apple, right? And I think this is kind of funny, but this, to me, is a very scary image, actually. This image actually terrifies me. You know what I mean? Like, and for a lot of different reasons, because I think when you're talking about the deployment of automated vision or autonomous vision, and vision is probably even the wrong word, you should probably be just saying sensing, because that's another thing, is that there are we have corporeal analogies that we use. Oh, there's a difference between hearing, seeing, this and that don't really apply when you start getting into this world as well. But again, thinking about consequences, like, none of these things are either built or deployed in a vacuum, right? And they're always designed to serve particular kinds of interests. And those interests in our society tend to be either money-making or law enforcement / state power, right? I mean, those are the big things that drive much of this work. And you can do all kinds of enormously powerful things with systems like this. So for example, there was a town in Texas. There was a company called Vigilant Solutions, and what it was doing was going around with cameras mounted on the backs of police cars and on their own cars, and all it was doing was reading the license plates of cars, right? So it collects these huge databases of where cars are. And one of the projects they did a few years ago was make a partnership with a county in Texas, and they said, okay, we have our huge database of license plates, we have our cameras that can read license plates. Why don't we put our cameras on the backs of all your police cars for free, and you're gonna attach our cameras to your databases of people who have, outstanding arrest warrants or tickets or whatever. And then as the cop drives around town, they'll automatically get pinged if our camera sees a car that has a fine or a warrant or something like that associated with it. And the cop has a credit card reader, can pull that person over and say, you have this outstanding warrant, you can pay it right now with a credit card, and it goes away. And Vigilant Solutions says, we get $25 service fee every time that happens, right? The municipality loves it because it's a way for them to generate money very easily. The company loves it, it's free money for them too. But what that ends up with very quickly is a situation like Ferguson, where you have these incredibly predatory municipal structures, right, that are disproportionately obviously going to affect people who are under surveillance or have had encounters with the law and haven't been able to kind of take care of that. So that's just one, but there's many, many, many of these different kinds of consequences, from the kind of practical to things that are a little bit more philosophical. And that's why this one scares me so much, which is that I think that when we're talking about progress or the assertion of rights or self-determination, I feel like social struggles are always struggles over meaning, right? So when we think about, histories of civil rights or feminism or things that most of us would agree are good things, like a huge part of those projects was to try to rename things, right? To create different kinds of associations. And that's come up a number of times here, is that how that frangibility of meaning is actually a really important means by which we exercise power, right? And self-determination. And that's why this scares me so much. Because
is your concern and your fear around this image related to the idea that the image is now produced in a way that its interpretation is always already encoded in it?
Yes.
And that it's already been machine read and possibly acted upon before the human eye has a chance to even begin to make sense of it? Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, it's that, but it's also part of an automated system, right? So for example, you could, like, what the license plate reading thing is a very obvious example. It's like, no, this is a license plate and it has this warrant attached to it, and that triggers this state intervention into somebody's life, right? But there's no way to contest that operation, right? Not that there's good ways to contest it either way, but what I'm saying, it solidifies power relationships that already exist.
So, I mean, I'm just thinking about historically, there have been all kinds of, surveillance systems put into place and images collected, whether photographically or cinematically. So what is it really about this new shift in visual culture that you're trying to explore in this machine vision work that is different? Is it about processing power of the image, the logistics of its networking, the ease of acting upon images efficiently as machines read them? Like, I'm trying to kind of get you to talk a little bit more about what is the paradigmatic shift that these technological transformations facilitate in terms of a broader...
I mean, I think the paradigmatic transformation is the fact that you don't need the human anymore. Right? And that you can operate at scale, right? You can literally perform operations on trillions of images, right? Which is something that just humans cannot do, right? And because you can do that, you can set up enforcement mechanisms for whatever you want at massive scales.
Okay.
Right? So you can easily imagine a smart sensing city that can enforce all jaywalking, that can enforce all, every car that exceeds the speed limit, every car that takes a right on a red turn. Like, you can, create these incredibly efficient mechanisms of enforcing whatever rules that you want to enforce, whether those are state rules or rules having to do with insurance or credit or that sort of thing. And I am concerned that comes at the expense of liberty. Really.
Did you want to talk about that?
Well, I mean, this is another example of that too. I mean, this is so for example, if you're have software that detects gender, you can be male or female, in the software. And what I'm saying is that gender is something that's very much being contested right now. We don't want to think about gender as just being this binaristic kind of thing. And so, for me, this kind of image is, again, showing that enforcement mechanism in place.
So, and you were saying earlier you felt like current theories of representation are insufficient for allowing us to understand the kind of lexicon of machine vision and what its implications might be. As an extension of theories of representation, we've had a lot of work on affect and imaging, and then there seems to be a new turn also in terms of logistical media, or what Harun Farokhi called the operational image. So do you see this work that you're doing now as really kind of delving deeper into those kinds of understandings of the visual and the power of the image?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's very much a kind of extension of the work that Harun Farokhi did on operational images. Peter Gallison has done some work on this question as well that's kind of picking up on. But Harun Farokhi did that he did iMachine and some articles he was writing about this in the early 2000s. And it was he was kind of looking at it, he's like, oh yeah, that's kind of weird. There's these other kinds of images that started to emerge. And I think like between then and now, that's actually become the dominant form of image making, like in the world. And so I do think that there's, that he definitely noticed that there was this thing that was happening, but it's just exploded since then, but largely invisibly.
Right. So after looking at a lot of this work, like how do machines look? How can you, as a human, describe how a machine looks or how it reads, how it senses? Like
it senses according to the forms of power that have been coded into it.
And so who's doing that?
Well, you pick your, who do you want? Like, so insurance companies are doing that. Law enforcement companies are doing that. Taser just bought a body cam company and a facial recognition company, right? So we all kind of had this idea, if cops wear body cams, then maybe they'll, police themselves a little bit more. Well, turn the body cam into an active sensor, right? That can recognize everybody, that can surveil people, that can create a record of everybody, right? So, I mean, there's many different domains in which this is happening, right?
It's incredible how fast it's happening, too. I remember in 1995, when this was during the war in Yugoslavia, when the then Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, had released satellite images of mass graves in Srebrenica. And these images were released 6 weeks after satellites had acquired them. And so there was a lot of discussion about the problematic delay in releasing these images to the world so that they might be used as a means of policy formation and possible intervention. But now what you're suggesting is that computer processing and image accumulation is happening so quickly, and these things are so efficient now that one could presumably see something instantly, and this is what we see with drone war, and then act in the image. So the image really becomes, the theater of intervention, of not something to look at in a contemplative gesture, but a logistical field of operation.
Absolutely.
And so we need, as scholars and critics and artists and scientists, to be thinking, I think, about this shift and what it means to not have the time to sit back and interpret and analyze what we are seeing in a way that maybe we had in the past, where machines are reading images for us and acting on them before we even have the time to notice. I think that's a really important thing to follow up on and intervene in. We just have about 2 minutes left. Do you have any final things that you want to mention before we
I guess
wrap up?
it's I think that I have come to think about it on two axes. There is this kind of horizontal axis of the camera taking a picture, doing something with it, whether that's shooting a missile or issuing a drone strike or affecting somebody's credit rating or what have you. But then also on a historical axis, because the other thing that is kind of new is that the constant accumulation of images, right? They don't go away. They can be retroactively mined, right? And so that's another dimension to this as well. And the part of that I worry about is to what extent do we become stuck in time, maybe? Because when you're having these very, like if you're creating a neural network or something like that that's going to analyze a body of data, you have to give it images from the past or data from the past. And the past can be a bad place. The past can be patriarchal and racist and that sort of thing. And so when you're teaching, these kinds of systems with data from the past, you're creating the conditions through which that past is continually reproduced.
Okay, I think we'll stop there so that we can move on with the other presentations. But thank you very much, Trevor.